This is Fresh Thinking with Optiro, the podcast where we share ideas from the world of mining and how they apply in industry today. Welcome to Fresh Thinking. This is episode 14. My name's Adam Mullett, and today I'm joined by Mark Warren, Managing Director of Optiro, who's also a member of the corporate team who do due diligence and valuation services. We're being very thorough and doing a 4-part series on due diligence. So the first part, which is this episode, is going to be on what is due diligence. The second part will be on the scope of a due diligence. Number 3 will be on how do you go about doing one. And number 4, some tips and traps for buyers and sellers. So welcome, Mark. Tell us about some of the history. I mean, how did you get involved in all this?
Well, Adam, I've been fortunate over pretty much most of my career to be involved in buying or selling of companies. M&A has been a big part of my life. And I say fortunate because I really enjoy it. And notwithstanding that I've really made some hard lessons along the way. More recently, I'm involved in helping others with due diligence exercises on buying mining companies or mineral assets. And I often get asked by the executives of the mining companies, be they MDs, directors, CEOs, what's involved in the DD? And I see a lot of uncertainty with people around, are they doing too much or too little as far as the amount of work to assess the opportunity and risk in what they're looking at. So I hope in a small way over this series we can demystify some of the issues around this broad topic of due diligence in these chats we're going to have.
Well, I guess it's a good time to ask, what is it? That's the theme of this episode. And maybe I can venture and say what I think it is. And really it's about doing your homework when you're going to buy something. Is that right?
Adam, absolutely. Broadly, it is about doing your homework. But the fact is everyone uses it just as you did in everyday conversation. Sometimes we talk about doing your due diligence on buying a new car or maybe a house or maybe it's a new relationship you're going to jump into. And, it's different from one person to the next. The reality is, however, due diligence has some very strict interpretations as well as some very broad interpretations. I mean, the first strict usage of the word due diligence applies in the Australian Commonwealth Corporations Act. And it's in the scenario where a company's doing a capital raising. Sections of the Act provide for what's called a due diligence defence against you, for you, I should say, not against you, making a misstatement in a document like a prospectus. Basically what that involves is you as the managing director and your team who's putting together the prospectus will be guided by your legal counsel and you'll form what's called a due diligence committee. And you'll sit down and you'll verify every claim made in your proposed prospectus as far as you possibly can to the source and fact of whether you're saying things that are absolutely true. If you can't verify the facts, you pull back and modify or delete the claims. Going through that process gives you a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card in as much that if you have gone through it honestly and done the reasonable efforts to look at every possible claim and you happen to miss something out, somebody comes down the way later as an investor that doesn't feel they did well out of it and they try to sue you, you can say, well, hang on, here's the process we went through. We looked at every claim. It was reasonable. We did our work. So that's a very strict interpretation of where due diligence is used.
But I understand due diligence, or sometimes you call it a DD. Yeah. That's not exactly how it applies in mining. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. You might ask why I even bothered going off into that definition. The reason I did that is because the very same people that we're talking to about doing due diligence for mining assets are the same people that have probably been through, as many of the listeners will have been through, doing a due diligence committee for a prospectus. So no, we're not looking at it as that strict interpretation from the Corps Act. However, the due diligence exercise we're doing, more to your point, Adam, of doing your homework, it still can provide you defence from even your own shareholders for if you buy an asset that it turns out wasn't to the expectation you thought when you were about to buy it. Again, you've shown reasonable measure and endeavour to look at the asset in a logical and systematic way with experts to see that it should have stacked up to what you want. It also is an opportunity for you to highlight all the things and test the claims being made by the seller that the asset really is what it is. And if the seller has misrepresented that, it provides you some opportunity to recoup any damages from those people if the asset wasn't as they described it as being. To understand this often misused term, I'm just going to digress and quote the definition that's in Black's Law Dictionary. Black's is a US publication, but it's universally applies in our part of the world as well. So Black's states that due diligence is as follows. It's such a measure of prudence, activity or assiduity as is properly to be expected from and ordinarily exercised by a reasonable and prudent person under the particular circumstances, not measured by any absolute standard, but depending on the relative facts of the special case.
Well, that's really easy to understand. I guess we can stop there, right?
Yeah, clearly not. I know it's a very erudite and somewhat legalese statement, but it's actually pretty simple if we break it apart. It does make some good sense, and it speaks to the fact that due diligence really is something that you undertake in context. What it's really saying is that you do enough and you dig deep enough depending on your circumstances. The key words in that definition are such a measure, meaning the right amount, and reasonable and prudent person, meaning what would commonly be expected in the circumstance. These vague terms may be open to interpretation, but in reality, when they are interpreted by somebody at law, it makes perfect sense what is reasonable in the circumstances.
So tell me, Mark, what does it mean to you when we're talking about this for mineral asset due diligence?
Okay. Our view as it applies to technical due diligence of mineral assets, and I should point out we are talking only technical due diligence in these discussion series, is that it's to undertake the reasonable and prudent actions that are to analyse the available data in a sensible and cost-efficient manner to understand the project fundamentals, identify any inconsistency and gaps or any fatal flaws. It's not a root and branch review of every source document to verify its origins and accuracy. It's to help you identify both the risks and the opportunities in what you're about to buy in a cost-efficient manner.
All right, well, maybe it's obvious, but when and why would you actually go and undertake a DD?
Okay, well, let me firstly speak to the why. In the end, the risks of a sale and purchase of an asset generally fall onto the purchaser, and the DD should be undertaken before committing to a sale contract. Undertaking due diligence is also part of your board's risk management strategy in any acquisition, either express or implied. I've seen examples where companies perform no DD at all before committing to an asset purchase. In these cases, I guess they feel they know enough about the asset from public or personal information that they can't possibly glean from doing a DD process. Or it could be that what they're buying is such a small and immaterial risk that the risk to them is minimal and they don't have a problem with just proceeding ahead and following their gut, so to speak. Such an approach is pretty rare, of course, and it comes with an elevated risk of unforeseen and unknown liabilities. As to when you do it, well, typically you start the DD at the time of making a deal to buy a business. And that's generally at the time that you sign a letter of intent or putting a term sheet together. And that term sheet or letter of intent would have a key condition that your purchase is subject to due diligence. Often, and we recommend this a lot, is that you might want to do a quick high-level review prior to executing LOI or certainly before you go into a term sheet. That's to see whether it's worth the effort in pursuing, if the asset fits your objectives, and whether you can put together a few other pieces in the jigsaw puzzle of stitching a deal together, which I'll talk more about in some of the later episodes. It can also vary on the seller, and depending on the process that their corporate advisor, and typically most sellers would have a corporate advisor helping them with the sales process, they might be running a process which is a staged process where you are bidding for the asset with a number of other parties at the same time, and you don't necessarily want to start a due diligence until you've got some exclusivity around that process. We'll talk more about that on later episodes as well.
All right, well, let's save it for the other episodes. That's the end of this one, which is on what is due diligence, the next episode is going to go into the scoping of a due diligence. If you'd like to hear more episodes of Fresh Thinking, head to our website, optiro.com, or you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Podcasts.